afternoon, everyone. That was as much to you as anyone else, because we have a very, very rich and interesting, important conversation coming up now. Before I say anything, even hello, I think, I'm supposed to say this is the GDPR disclaimer. As we all know, it's very important to follow the rules nowadays. So we would like to say that this is a public event. So in the public's interest, photographs and media footage might be taken throughout the public discussion under the lawful basis of legitimate interest. If any one of you have an issue with that, please I think this lot over here, you will not be seen in camera. But also, otherwise, please let us know, because otherwise we will film this, just so you know. And that's a good thing, because we know, many of us have seen the report and we know the importance of this conversation. So also, we have been joined not only by a fantastic panel of experts, but also, of course, you good colleagues in the room, who I know have many relevant backgrounds to the topic that we are to discuss. We also have colleagues joining online that we will try to engage as well through the chat function coming up here, if there's, of course, trying to make the room for everyone to engage actively in this conversation. So, now to the formal opening. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues. On behalf of the director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, Ambassador Thomas Greminger, it is my very great pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to the GCSP and the House of Peace, Maison de la Paix, here in Geneva, for the European launch of the Global Peace Index 2023. My name is Annika Helin Norberg. I'm Head of Peace Operations, Peace Building here at the GCSP, and I very much look forward to facilitate the conversation here in the next 90, probably 88 minutes that we still have. And we are, first of all, very delighted and appreciate the ongoing, long, fruitful cooperation that we have with the Institute of Economics and Peace, which, as all of you no doubt know, is an Australian pioneering platform for the development and promulgation of concrete and evidence-based research on the status of peace or the lack of peace in the world. And of course, most renowned is the Global Peace Index that we are to launch today. In addition, of course, IAP does several other indexes also that we are cooperating with them in launching. But that I think Serge will talk about a little bit later. So indeed, we are very thrilled to have this conversation this afternoon, and also having been joined by our outstanding partners and experts, also from the Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining, and also the Northeastern University from the United States, and also the UN University Center for Policy Research, another partner here in Geneva. And this, I should say, that's about it. That's all I'm thrilled about, because then, of course, the content of the report of the Peace Index 2023 is really disturbing and not encouraging at all. I don't want to steal the thunder from Serge and the report presentation, but just to say that those of you who know me know that I'm normally very optimistic about things, but for the 2023 index, makes really grim reading. The list of challenges to peace and security in the world, both at the global level, but also in many parts of the local spaces, is very long, and Serge will take us through this in a few minutes. And before I introduce him to make the first intervention, let me just make two general remarks before opening up the session. And one regards the timing, and the other one relates to content. First, I believe that the Global Peace Index 2023 could not come at a more important time. As we all know, there is the initiative, given all the daunting challenges, there is the initiative by the United Nations and the Secretary General to having launched our common agenda in 2021. And now the international community is working on contributing to the development of a new agenda for peace, which is coming out in a few weeks' time. and the topics. So feeding into that conversation and basing it on some of the findings that comes out in this report is, of course, very useful. And just this morning, I should also say that there was a conversation hosted by our partners, Geneva Peacebuilding Platform, and Adam on his team on the Future Summit, the Summit of the Future. And again, the topics that was listed there comes again and again in the report that we are to discuss. So the timing is very important to feed into the preparation for the future of the summit. Secondly, and that comes to the content, or building further on the thinking of the content. I was just reading the priorities that have been highlighted to be covered by the new agenda for peace, and we all, of course, know them. It's reducing strategic risk, developing better capacities for strategic foresight and strategic anticipation, invest in peace building and prevention, regional prevention being also a priority, and putting women and girls at the center, and then also addressing new and different all forms of violence has been highlighted to be a key focus as we move forward on peace and security. And as those of you who read the report or previous reports knows that this is exactly the areas in which the different indicators that IAP is working on, they actually speaks to this topic. And of course, given that this is the 17th iteration of the index, seems that you were 17 years ahead of the game and really now feeding in. So those of you who want to make a difference on peace and security moving forward should pay attention. So without further ado, now of course we come to the content, and it's my absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Serge Strobont, who is the Director of Europe and MENA region of the IEP, and of course has been pioneering and chaperoning through this year in and year out on different indexes. So Serge, what's new this year?
Well, thank you very much, Annika, for your introduction. Thank you to my fellow panelists at GCSP, Northeastern, and also to you for showing up today. Yeah, it's not good news. And you will see during my PowerPoint presentation that every figure is going to blow your mind more than the figure you saw before. I thought maybe this year I can start by, going over the press release and going over, the interviews that I gave in the past 3-4 days. And what are the key findings? Well, basically, this is the worst year when it comes to battle deaths or casualties in conflict. Since 1994 and the genocide in Rwanda, we had close to 250,000 people who died in conflict last year, directly in conflict. So you can imagine what the indirect impact of conflict is also. And you need to put this into a larger perspective, because this is something that we have been seeing in the past 10 to 15 years, or the 17 years that you were talking about. This is the 9th consecutive year when we see a decrease in peace on the Global Peace Index. We see more and more countries engaging in or falling into the violence trap, into conflict. And we see also more and more of those conflicts internationalizing and therefore lasting longer, creating more casualties and, of course, a larger impact also. Generating more refugees. I think we are the highest ever, that's close to, I think it must be around 110, 115 million. So clearly also generated by not only Ukraine, but definitely also Ukraine had a large part of that also. Internally displaced persons, we have also seen that civil unrest has been on the rise for more than a decade, more than 250%, and together with that political instability also. So yeah, I mean, I could stop my presentation over here and you would understand that we are not really looking at something very positive when it comes to the state of peacefulness this year globally. So I don't know if we can start with my PowerPoint presentation, and then, let's start with a presentation of the Global Peace Index 2023. So what we do in the Global Peace Index is measuring peace in a complex world, basically. So I'm going to talk about key findings, about larger trends, and go into the details about the cost of violence and also some evolutions in some very specific countries. Next. So the Institute for Economics and Peace is a non-for-profit think tank. What we do is measure and quantify peace, but also identify the positive evolutions which a society will go through once it invests in positive peace. The Global Peace Index is looking at what we call negative peace, which is the absence of violence or the fear of violence. Next. So We do quite a lot of, let's call it propaganda. No, we do a lot of communication, especially social media. As you can see, we have quite a high number of unique visitors on our website. We are referenced in thousands of books, tens of thousands of academic publications, but also university courses. We do a lot of work for governments, multilaterals, a lot of consultancy work over there also. As you can see, we reached last year a record of 40 billion media impressions, which is really like, for us amazing to achieve. What we try to do is basically address three main audiences. Would be general public, so we put a lot of emphasis on translating something which can be very dry, very dull statistics into, through the socioeconomic analysis, which we are adding to those indexes in something that is quite enjoyable to read if you do not concentrate too much on the bad news, which is basically produced every year. But it's just like the messenger, we're not producing the bad news. So the second audience is definitely an academic audience. So there you go, guys. And the third audience would be policymakers, decision makers, because we want those people to develop legislation and develop policy and make decisions based on facts and figures and empirically derived analysis. Next. So let's have a look at the key findings. Next. So the Global Peace Index is a complex composite index looking at 23 different indicators distributed over three main domains. So we look at 6 measures of ongoing domestic and international conflict. As you could understand, that's not going well. We're looking at 10 measures of societal safety and security, and we definitely also look at measures of militarization, in which there is one positive measure, and that's the investment in peacekeeping operations. Next. So this is a map which you can find back on our website. So everything is open source at the Institute for Economics and Peace. The full report, the 4 pages that you guys have received, interactive maps like this one, available on our website, visionofhumanity.org. So on the map, what you can do is, of course, you have the color code, which is showing you, well, those regions where there's a lot of peace, those regions where a little bit less of peace, and then definitely the red ones where there is a huge problem when it comes to the levels of peacefulness. I mean, especially academic environment, you can also click on each of the countries, access all the data per indicator, per family of indicator, and globally also. So that's really an interesting resources to work with. Next. So what we see is, as I explained to you, 13 deteriorations in the last 15 years, the 9th consecutive deterioration, 0.42%. So that's a huge deterioration in peace last year. As you can see, more countries became more peaceful than countries which deteriorated, which is showing you that it is very difficult to increase your levels of peace. And when you do that, it's really bits of a percent. Once you fall into the violence trap, once you fall into conflict, into deterioration, destabilization, this can go very fast, sometimes with 2 digits percent, 10, 12, 15, 20% also. So it's much more difficult to create peace than to basically destroy it and fall into conflict and violence. The improvements last year were driven by changes in the terrorism impact, political terror scale, and military expenditure as a percentage of GDP. So you need to be very careful there. As a percentage of GDP, military expenditure went down, and that's a trend over a larger period of time, more than a decade. But if you would look at the nominal investment in the military, this has gone up, actually. So really the number of dollars spent, it went up. And what we have also witnessed last year is a disparity in the type of investment in militarization. So you will see the big players, China first, more than 180 billion extra, the United States more than 70 billion extra, India also. So the big players are really investing into the military, while the majority of the countries in the world, also influencing this statistic, do not have the luxury to invest in their military, to invest into violence containment, because they are faced by much more important priorities first. For example, a country engaged in conflict will spend about 35 to 40% of its GDP on violence. So you know also, if 40% of your budget is going to one post, there is no other priority than this one. So clearly there a very difficult situation there. Deteriorations came from conflict, political instability, and clearly there what we have also seen is a rise in the number of violent demonstrations also, which is linked to this increase in civil unrest and political instability. Yes. So Iceland remains the most peaceful country in the world. A couple of years ago, the Prime Minister of Iceland online made the keynote speech for the presentation of the Global Peace Index. And of course, we always congratulate them, telling the Icelandic people, well, great guys who have been #1 for 17 years. But she said, yeah, we're only 6th on the Positive Peace Report. So there's still a lot of work to do. And I thought this was so inspiring because if your #1 is telling you there's still a lot of work to do, while being consistently #1 for 17 years, well, that's a perfect example for all the other 162 countries on the index. The largest improvement came from Libya and Burundi. The largest regional improvement comes from Middle East and North Africa, although it is still the least peaceful region in the world. So, least peaceful region of the world, but we have seen improvements in the past 3 consecutive years. Why? Because the conflicts in Libya, in Iraq, also partially in Syria and Yemen also have achieved now a lower level of intensity and also a lower number of casualties. Europe is still the most peaceful region of the world, but slight improvement in the past year. So clearly there, even if we are engaging in a lot in the conflict in Ukraine, clearly there, when it comes to the other indicators in the index, we're doing quite a good job in Europe also. Next. Afghanistan remains 163 on the index, so the worst, least peaceful nation, but also there we have recorded increase in peacefulness, one of the largest increases in peacefulness. And I will show you afterwards also a graph when it comes to the level of violence and the number of casualties generated in this region, in this country afterwards. The number of conflict deaths increased by almost 100%, so that's absolutely not a good sign. Of course, the steepest regional deteriorations, Russia and Eurasia. I think it's very, very understandable, although, and you will see that later also, the conflict in Ukraine has not been the most deadly conflict in 2022. So that was Ethiopia and Tigray. But of course, the emphasis on either or of those conflicts was completely different, with the permanent information and influence operation going on in the Ukraine and Russia, while nobody had access to the conflict zone in Ethiopia and Tigray, neither journalists, nor the humanitarian workers, nor UN officials. So clearly there another emphasis. But the most deadly conflict this year or last year in 2022 was the conflict in Ethiopia and Tigray, with more than 100,000 casualties, while the estimations for Ukraine are about 86,000. And these 100,000 casualties were really those in the conflict, through the famine which was generated through and after the conflict. I think you can easily add 200,000 indirect victims of the conflict also there. So those figures are absolutely not in relation with the emphasis which is giving to those conflicts. So 6 of the 9 regions on the Global Peace Index recorded deteriorations last year. So that's not really good. Next. So this is the top 10 of the most peaceful countries in the world. And if you would expand that to 15, 20, you will find a lot of smaller countries, liberal democracies, of course, with some, I would say, with some exceptions confirming the rule. But you will see that today still a liberal democracy in a small state, so not really engaging fully into the geopolitical game, you will find them back on top of the Global Peace Index. And of course, you have countries like Iceland and New Zealand, those really isolated islands somewhere in an ocean, not really impacted by external influences which could generate violence, or which could, of course, generate a spillover violence in those countries also. So clearly one form of political system, which is on top of the Global Peace Index. And as you can see, not a lot of movement. And if there is a movement, it's not really a big movement on top of the index. Next. And unfortunately, I can make the same comments for the bottom of the Global Peace Index. Once you get into this violence trap, once you get into this conflict, it is very, very difficult to get out of there. And really too, because the investment you need to make is so massive. And I'm not only talking about the financial investment, but really the investment you need to make to change the mindset, to change the path of your society as a system is really, just among us. So we can see there countries directly affected affected by conflict, almost all of them, and you can see that the improvements are in the MENA region, really those conflicts which are less intense today than they were a couple of years ago. And I think they're also one of the main drivers is the lower impact of the relative impact of terrorism in those countries. Next. So these are the 5 largest, I would say, increases in peacefulness. So countries like Libya, Burundi, which I spoke about, Afghanistan I spoke about too, Oman and Côte d'Ivoire. Next. And of course, you also have the 5 largest deteriorations coming up. And those would be... Yep. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, so definitely Mali, but also Ethiopia. We will have Haiti, Israel, Ukraine, of course, and Russia engaged in the conflict. Next. So let's look at the trends in peace. So basically open a time window to about 15 years. Yes. So as you could see, 9 consecutive years of deteriorations, and really when over the past 15 years, we just had a couple of improvements, very, very low improvements compared to the level of deteriorations which we had over the past 15 years. Therefore, over a large period of time, you would see that the levels of peacefulness have decreased by approximately 3 to 3.5% over a period of 15 years. So, and basically influenced by conflict over the same period of time. Next. Exactly what I just said. So you can clearly see that safety and security remain stable, a deterioration so in the domain ongoing conflict, and an improvement as percentage of GDP for levels of militarization worldwide. Yeah, next. So as you can see, I don't know if it's really visible, but those are the 23 indicators. So you can see that the majority of the indicators deteriorated over the past 15 years, while only a minority really improved over the past 15 years, which of course generated this decrease by 3.5% in the levels of peacefulness over the same period of time. Next. So this is the total number of battle deaths. So you can clearly see that 2022 is an outbound data when it comes to the evolution of the battle death. And as I explained to you before, almost 100% increase in the number of casualties last year. Next. So this is a double slide showing you basically 2 neighboring regions, where one region, which we would call coastal West Africa, would record increases in peacefulness really from Morocco down to Ghana, while next to it, of course, the Sahel region, and more in particular countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, really targeted and really triggered by the impact of terrorism in those countries. But more than this, I mean, I really consider terrorism as being a consequence of a lot of other things going wrong in the same country. So you can have neighboring countries going into 2 different paths. So one really affected, and one of the largest decreases globally, but definitely also in Africa, Mali, Burkina Faso next to it. But still you see that western coastal West Africa is becoming more peaceful at the same moment in time. So clearly there, not always a spillover. You can have a concentration of violence while the others, the neighbors, can still continue to become more peaceful. Yeah, next. Economic value of peace. And now if you're already impressed by the figures I mentioned before, well, be ready, because those ones are really going to blow you away. So last year, and this is a very, very conservative estimation, a statistical estimation, we spent about $17.5 trillion in violence, or on violence and violence containment. So that's 17% more than the year before. It's about 13% of the world GDP. It's about $2,200 per person present in this room and present on Earth also. So yeah, that's really not good news. There's one comment we make this year when it comes to that. When we see all the wars of modern wars, and we can even go back, to Vietnam, we even go back 40, 50 years back. Well, those modern wars cannot be won and always come with a huge economic impact. So I would say, if Mr. Putin or other leaders would ask our advice about should I start start a war, but maybe you should present the invoice first and explain to them, not only through the sanctions and not only through the direct impact on the economy, but the impact on the global economy, what a war is going to generate as a financial and economic impact, next, of course, to the human impact and the destruction that a war can generate. So there's no winners in a war, and a modern war cannot be won, that's for sure. Just imagine what you could do if you would use, or if you could reduce that by 1 or 10%. A reduction by 1% of this figure would double the total budget for overseas development aid globally. So you could invest double into development globally. If you would go for 10%, you can double the foreign direct investment globally, or you could generate 3 economies the size of countries like Switzerland, Denmark, let's say Belgium this time, or maybe Ireland. So 3 major economies can be generated through, just taking 10% from this amount of money. I think it is absolutely crazy to understand that. Next. And when you look at the distribution of this 17.5 trillion, you will see that 80% goes straight into violence containment. So about 40%, 44% is going into the military. Of course, this is going up and up and up in nominal worth. Internal security, so basically police forces, goes up about for 30%. And then we see a portion there for these private security and military companies, the PMCs, the Wagners of this world, although after last weekend, we don't know what's going to be left of this organization. But we see an investment in that also. It means that more than 80, up almost to 85% of the investment into violence goes to violence containment or goes to forces, military forces, security forces. Less than 20% is related to the direct impact of violence, so people getting killed through homicide, through suicide, violent crime, and definitely conflict also. So you need to understand that's a political choice there, if you want to invest in that or not. Yes, next. And as you can see, it's different per region. So of course it's very small, so you cannot always see, but depending in the region in which you are, and I would say the distribution between violence containment, between army, security forces, and direct impact is going to be completely different, depending if you have conflicts present in your region, if you have the capacity to invest in the military, or capacity to invest in violence containment. Next. So what we also see, we did research this year on the potential blockade of Taiwan, so by China, of course, and a successful blockade by about 40%. So what we would see there is that this would have such an economic impact, of course, on Taiwan, definitely also on China, but globally also, that it's really not a good idea to start with this type of initiatives. So we see that the Chinese blockade on Taiwan would lead to a drop in global economy, about 2.7 trillion in the first year, and to about 3% of the global GDP. This would be double of what we experienced in the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. So we don't want to get there. What we also see is that, and we can go straight to the next slide. We can also see that the main trade partners of China are large Western countries with a strong military also. So when you start to see those relations, when you start to identify this economic impact, it's clearly not a good idea. I would say in particular, it's never a good idea to start confrontation, conflict, and war. Definitely not when it comes to this part of the world. Next. So let's talk about Ukraine a little bit. And of course, I'm not going to go into detail of the security situation or the counterattack at the moment, but let's look at some figures for Ukraine. Next. So you can clearly see there an increase in 2022 when it comes to the number of casualties. I said an estimation around 86,000, and you can see around Kiev and of course on the front lines in the southeast front lines, which today again a lot of people are getting killed. Next. So there again, a huge investment, close to 450 billion, which is 63% of the Ukrainian GDP. So you can imagine that those guys only have one priority at the moment, and of course, almost a 500% increase when it comes to the economic impact and violence to Ukraine. Next. What we also noticed is Yeah, basically they have a lack of young men to go to battle. When you look at the class between, or the age group between 20 and 24, almost 65% of those young men are not present in Ukraine, or either they're out of the country or they died into battle. When you go to 25 to 29, it's still 54%. So especially now, shifting from defense to offense, which is basically a coefficient 9 in the number of people you need to have. When you don't have the human resources to really go into battle, you of course need to go and try to get help into what we will call enablers and force multipliers, and come up with plans which allow you to do some form of counterattack with the low number of people still present in your country. Next. So let's look at some trends and hotspots for conflict. Yes. So what we also see is that, as I explained to you before, it's not only Ukraine, Ethiopia, Mali, Myanmar. 2022, we saw the drops in Afghanistan and in Yemen, so that's clearly good. We saw that this increase in conflict, this increase in the number of battles, that this increase in violence started before the Russian invasion. So that's again a trend which has been reinforced by another event, being the war in Ukraine. Like we have seen other trends starting in 15-16, reinforced by other crises like COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine also. I explained to you that there were more battle deaths or conflict deaths in Ethiopia than Ukraine. And we have seen also a larger internationalization of conflicts taking place. So we have seen 79 countries really with an increase in the level of conflict, and we see 91 countries being permanently affected by conflict today. Next. So that's the trend in key ongoing conflicts as an indicator. So you can clearly see we were doing a good job, but in the past 4 to 5 years, it's not going in the right direction, and in a very steep way. Next. This is, of course, looking at Ethiopia. So you can clearly see the estimation there, which is higher than the estimation for Ukraine. And please bear in mind this indirect cost of violence in Ethiopia also. Next. Same thing for Mali. I think there what we are witnessing is, of course, the impact of international terrorism or jihadist groups taking profit of the fact that the central government is only basically ruling over 25-30% of the territory, and all the rest of the territory in Mali is just open for those groups to be very active and unfortunately effective also. And what we see also more and more is the government generating conflict and generate casualties, but also what we would call inter-ethnic conflict and inter-ethnic casualties and conflict being generated. Next. Same thing for Myanmar. So of course we have seen an evolution of the protest, an evolution of the protest against the coup, and of course I would say an institutionalization of the rebellion, turning into something which is much more military in the response which they are giving to the central power in Myanmar. So therefore also an increase in the forms of violence and the number of casualties. Next. I think we're here in Afghanistan, so we clearly see a drop in the number of casualties after, I would say, August 2021. So I'm not telling you that this is a nice country to live in. It's still the least peaceful country in the world. But what we can see is that through the past evolutions, we have seen a really drastic drop in the number of casualties in this country, and therefore this increase in peacefulness also on the global peace index. Next. And I think, yeah, I was sure this was the last one. So you can follow us on our social media. Definitely visionofhumanity.org is a piece of open source resource for you. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. More than happy to take your questions in the Q&A afterwards. And I'm really looking forward to the interventions of my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Serge, for that very comprehensive and indeed thought-provoking presentation of the key findings. And of course, we're going to do like this, colleagues, that we will, if you agree, please, since there's a lot of people, which is wonderful, also a lot of issues, and we have some great speakers. So if you agree, we'll take note of your questions and so on. Also, those colleagues that are online. My colleague Hajer, she's also, if you write things in the chat or whatever, she's going to send it to me on my phone later on. And also just therefore to say that when we come to that part of speakers, there will be microphones. And also I want to point out my dear colleague, Sarah Soger, who's taking pictures over there, who's supporting the event. We have Lilla and Florian behind there. So these are people that are helping the whole conversation. But before moving over there, just highlighting that, again, thank you so much, Serge, for coming and sharing these findings. There's so many things to be unpacked, and that I think really poses some difficult questions. Just a couple of, just noting on the issue in Afghanistan, the very diminishing rate of deaths there. But of course, at the same time, you have 19 million women and girls who all of a sudden don't have human rights. So the question is, what for the long term, what will be the implications of that? And then they said, I really appreciate you mentioned also in terms of Iceland and the positive peace, because this is of course a really important part of this work, the linkage to the positive peace principle. So we can, it's okay to be despaired, but then we have to get up and get going and really to link it to forward moving work and strategy. So thank you also for raising that. Lots of other things, but I will hold my horses and introduce the next speaker, which is Ambassador Stefano Toscano, who is the director since about 10 years of our neighboring sister organization here in the building, Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining. Ambassador Toscano is, as you guess, is a Swiss diplomat, has a long-standing career, and also at the back of it, also a PhD in natural sciences, I should say. But Ambassador, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Annika, to you and to the GCSP for inviting me today to this exciting presentation. Congratulations to IP for coming up with such an interesting report. It's actually rather bewildering, Serge, to listen to you and all the figures that you have presented. And I don't know how I will be able to make it out of bed tomorrow morning, but I will try. So you already said a lot of key findings and key points. But let me start just by pointing to two of them. As you said, 2022 was the deadliest year for armed conflict since the 1994 Rwandan genocide, the deadliest year in the history of the index. And the level of global peacefulness has deteriorated by 5% since 2008. Now, we at the Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining, we actually feel this development in our work on a daily basis, so to speak. We are dedicated to mine action and ammunition management, but particularly mine action. And mine action in the past used to be what I would define a post-conflict activity. That is, a conflict is over and the land is regrettably contaminated with mines, anti-personnel mines, land mines, but at least you have a stable situation and you work towards getting rid of these mines. Now, with the evolution of the situation at geostrategic level, regional level, national level, as pointed out in the report, we find ourselves that we need to operate ever more closer to or in conflict. And Yemen, Ukraine are two examples. And this has been quite a challenge and quite a change also for the sector. Because of course you operate under very different circumstances. We remain a humanitarian actor that needs to operate under humanitarian principles. For that we need to have a humanitarian space, which is not easy to get. What we see, what we are faced increasingly are prolonged, more urbanized, more messy conflict, if I may say. When I say messy, I mean that typically what we witness in recent years is a proliferation of armed groups within a single country or a single conflictual context, and it makes it even more difficult to operate for humanitarian actors. And the fact that those conflicts are prolonged, their length is increasing, makes it imperative, if you want to respond to the humanitarian imperative to protect civilians from mines, to be able to be active there as well. So we see what you say very concretely in our work. Let me just touch upon 3 points, at the risk of repeating a little bit what you said, Serge. On the economic front, if you look at the economic impact of violence, so the global economic impact of violence is defined as the expenditure and economic effect related to containing, preventing, and dealing with the consequence of violence. And as you pointed out, in 2022, the impact of violence on the global economy was a staggering figure, $17.5 trillion in purchasing power parity. And this, you said it, it's equivalent to close to 15% of the global GDP, 13 actually. And that's this economic impact has increased 8 times in the last 14 years. And there is an additional figure that we need to take into account, and you mentioned the nominal growth in military expenditure. So the economic impact of that increased by almost 17% and total 1.1 trillion. And this is a world record. So this really needs to serve as a wake-up call to every leaders in the world. The world is spending almost 20 trillion US dollar per year in either remedying the effects of violence or generating more means to create violence. We just simply cannot afford to continue like that. My second point is on the need for solutions for positive peace. You said this is about negative peace. The other side of the coin is positive peace. So your report demonstrates it clearly that the economic benefits from greater peace are significant and can benefit everyone, every state, every segment of society. And the most peaceful countries that you listed, the top 10, perform very highly on what are the 8 pillars of positive peace, and are more likely to maintain stability and recover from shocks. So solutions for positive peace cannot be delayed further, and I think it is important here to underline how, in a way, these pillars of positive peace can be aligned with, I would say, the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. So the linkage needs to be made there. And you showed some very interesting figures. Saving 10% would give us so many means to invest in the things that actually should be considered a real priority today. The fight against poverty cannot wait. Addressing climate change cannot wait. The possibility of a next pandemic cannot wait. Action on gender and diversity cannot wait. Annika, you were pointing out this very point with respect to Afghanistan. So there are stringent and key agendas out there that need funding and need to be addressed as a priorities. And the SDGs represent an important frame in that report, in that respect. So once again, the JPI shows us clearly that building peace is in the long term more economically and socially beneficial than preparing for war and proliferating the tools of violence. Let me finish with maybe a little bit more personal considerations. So let me point out again four issues four key findings that I found particularly distressing in a way. The level of global peacefulness, I said it at the beginning, has deteriorated by 5% since 2008. The gap between the least and the most peaceful countries continue to grow. This is an important point. The countries in the 2 groups of most peaceful or least peaceful remain essentially the same. highlighting the stickiness of peacefulness at both ends of the index. This is a very important point. You are stuck in that situation. We need to be able collectively to find ways to get unstuck from those situations. I mean, the least, because remaining the most peaceful, you don't want to get unstuck there. And finally, there are 15 countries where at least 5% of the population are either refugees or internally displaced. This is very distressing indeed. So it is admittedly difficult not to despair a little. What can be done? Where to start? I mean, we all know, and we will hear also from other colleagues, that there is a lot that is happening already, and many, many actors are engaged in peace efforts, and this is, of course, highly commendable. If we look at the components of positive peace, we see 3 components: attitudes, institutions, and structures. So what about the individual level? What is it that we can do ourselves as individuals to contribute a little bit to peace? And here I was struck by another key finding of the report regarding attitudes, and I quote, "The attitudes domain deteriorated by 2% globally from 2009 to 2022. This domain deteriorated in 99 of the total 163 countries assessed, reflecting increased polarization of views on political and economic administration matters, as well as a deterioration in the quality of information disseminated to the public," end of quote. So here is where I feel we can all come in our daily life. We should all work honestly and inclusively towards consensus rather than division. We should all contribute to fight fake news and manipulative information and help re-establish trust in what one sees, hears, and reads. It might seem a little thing, but this trust is absolutely essential in my opinion. So to me, when I think as an individual, those are things that might not be that big on the larger scale, but still represent a starting point to make daily a little difference. And maybe they can provide also something upon which others can build. Thank you. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for taking us from the very strategic global reflections on the economic costs, and then also bringing it all down to the individual level and the importance of exercising leadership, all of us at every day and every moment. And this brings, it's a wonderful segue to our next speaker, of course, who will join us, who will join us now, share her remarks. It's Professor Denise Garcia. She is professor of Northeastern University and a founding faculty member of Experiential Robotics Institute. I think she's got the most interesting CV I've ever seen, I must say. It would take 15 minutes to explain it to you, but it's absolutely fantastic. And just one, of course, which is a topic that is at the head of everyone's mind nowadays, is the AI military race, common good governance in the age of artificial intelligence. That's just an appetizer. I know, Professor, the word is over to you. Comments.
Thank you, Annika. This is the most exciting greeting ever. So thank you so much. It's lovely to be here in this Maison de la Paix again. Me as a former student of the Graduate Institute of International Studies here and a former fellow of the Swiss National Science Foundation, I'm so delighted to be here in this house of peace that as a student here back then, I waited for so long. So I have been very excited to be in touch with Serge for so many months about this event, Serge. By email, by text, and I had the privilege of seeing the slideshow Serge shared with me, and I said, oh my God, how is he going to go through all this? I would need 2 days to go through this slideshow, so bravo Serge, wow. Les Bruxellois vraiment sont magnifiques. Hein? So I would like to salute the leaders of the future here, sitting here, 23 students and 3 team member leaders from Northeastern University in Boston who are present here. And I would like also to salute Dr. Cathy Clement, students who are here present for the annual GCSP course, which is extremely important as well. It's very easy for me to talk about my favorite database, the Global Peace Index. I am a social scientist who uses a lot of databases, and this is probably my very favorite, and I believe the Global Peace Index provides an essential service for humanity, Serge, and for the achievement of prosperity and guiding countries on the achievement of prosperity. So taken together with other Institute for Economics and Peace databases like the Ecological Threat Report and others that you produce every year, so magnificently, you can really have a complete picture. And I believe the Institute of Economics and Peace makes a huge difference in providing the most authoritative source on peace and security. And should actually be nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize, which I plan to do this year, nominating you for the Nobel Peace Prize. Everyone talks about war. Everyone does. Everyone tries to measure war, but it is the Institute for Economics and Peace and the Global Peace Index that measures peace and tells the world how to create the conditions for permanent peace. My involvement with the Institute of Economics and Peace started 10 years ago. When I came across for the very first time about this database, the Global Peace Index, I couldn't believe my luck. I said, oh my God, this is terrific. So I got in touch immediately with what was then the initiator, one of the creators of this database, Daniel Hislop. And I went all the way to Sydney to see him and spend a couple months there. And I became a part of the research committee for the Institute and went to Sydney several times. Dozens of my students from Northeastern University were hired in the past years. And dozens of them became peace ambassadors. And I think I have 2 here in this room. So we also hosted Steve Kilea very recently in Boston for a lunch, a private lunch with him. Steve Kilea, the founder of the Institute for Economics and Peace, and all my students present here were hosting him with me. So let's take some main takeaways from this year's finding, but let's first remember what positive peace is. As Ambassador Toscano reminded us, positive peace is the attitudes, the institutions and structures which create and sustain peace in societies. So this is more than negative war, right? It's more than the simply absence of violence. You have to create attitudes, institutions and structures that you feel when you are in a city walking around Oslo, or you are walking around Stockholm, or you are walking around Brussels. So you feel that there is that presence of these attitudes, institutions, and structures. So positive peace then describes an environment under which human potential can flourish. So are we having this environment where human potential can flourish? Obviously not, by looking at the data. So how can we get the data and use the data, right? How can we get this data? So the data from the Global Peace Index, for me, is a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call for every one of us here in this room, future leaders, and also the leaders already in leadership positions. And it gives the world 3 warnings. The first warning is, actions taken now are not at all creating an environment for human potential to flourish. On the contrary, these actions taken now are only fueling violence, are fueling inequality, insecurity, and poverty. Secondly, leaders are not focusing on the right matters at all. They are completely unfocused. I thought the pandemic would redirect attention to the right questions affecting humanity, but it did not. So leaders are diverting, for me, the intellectual, social, financial resources of humanity to building more weapons every year, with an expenditure of $1.1 trillion, a record for that. And they're working on building an unsustainable world in many levels. Thirdly, combined, the world is spending about $20 trillion in a year. And those $20 trillion are being spent in two ways. One way is to coping with and fixing the horrific effects of violence. Suicide, homicides, my own country, Brazil, we have a high homicide rate. So refugees, terrorism, so just coping, just trying to fix the horrifying effects of spending in weapons, spending in war. And the other way the world is spending this $20 trillion is building more weapon systems, more military record spending. So, my book coming up is where I looked at how there is this process of weaponization of a set of technologies known as artificial intelligence. So therefore, I'm here completely concerned that yet another set of technologies will be weaponized and not used for the common good of humanity. So in sum, the Global Peace Index alerts the world that it's high time to build the structures, the attitudes, and the institutions to bridge inequalities and build a more prosperous world. And it gives us the tools, the steps for us to do so and to equip humanity to tackle the global catastrophic risks affecting humanity right now. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that very insightful contribution. It also reminded me, you mentioned about the urgency and the wake-up call required. And of course, the new situation is also such, and I think it's highlighted with these islands of peace and also the island of absence of peace. In my own country, or originating country, Sweden, only in a few years, we moved to being really a peaceful place to now having tremendous challenges in terms of gang violence. And it used to be, when I grew up, which is a long time ago, you read about someone being shot like once a year or something in the newspaper. Now, it's not a single day I open the morning paper without someone has been shot. And that's a huge difference in only a few years' time, which means that we need to be vigilant, just as the professor said, because it's all changing. And we all really have to exercise that leadership that Ambassador spoke about to make the place a better world. And in order to guide us further on that topic, commenting on the report will, of course, be Adam Day, Dr. Adam Day, who is kind of a new, I'm not sure I can still say that you're a new kid on the block. Not so much. He's been here a year and been more impactful than ever. So head of this new UN University organization here in Geneva, he brings to the conversation, a very rich experience from peacekeeping, peace building at the policy level, in the field. He's a legal, he's a civil society, and I can speak for another half hour, but I know you wouldn't like it, so I'm handing over to you.
I think it's turned on. Okay, great. Thanks to IEP and GCSP, it's great to be here. And really, I want to echo Denise's points. I mean, I'm a conflict researcher, and much of my work over the last many years has been trying to get data on conflict trends, trying to understand what's happening, and spending a lot of time running around different conflict settings, trying to figure out what's going on and hiring enumerators. And we rely on a lot of pretty suspicious information, and a lot of it's hard to find, it's complicated to generate, and it's often misleading. And I really think that this is why the GPI is so important. It's doing much of the empirical work that we're often quite bad at. It's robust, it's cleanly laid out, and it's framed in a meaningful way. Even though the PowerPoint's sometimes a little bit difficult to read from a distance. And I think it's the best resource on global conflict trends by a long shot. And one of the things I actually want to point to, which is maybe some of the most interesting pages of this report that weren't in the presentation, it's pages 70 through 73, which talks about the systems approach that they take. And I'd encourage you all to look at it. A systems approach, it's beyond political economy, I think, in this. It understands that change is not nonlinear. It understands that concepts like tipping points and attractor basins and feedback loops are integral to how change happens. And I think this is actually one of the most important conceptual framings of how to move from conflict to peace. And I think it's actually more important than it sometimes gets credit for in this report. I just want to zoom in on very quickly 5 findings and ask 5 questions to Serge. I can summarize all 5 questions as really, Serge, what the heck is going on? But beneath these numbers, but maybe a little bit more specificity. I think that you started with this, but this 96% increase in conflict-related deaths is really shocking. I remember being in 2017 working with UN University on a study that tracked a slower spike in conflict-related deaths that were attributed to the Arab Spring, to a growing role of regional players in domestic conflicts, the post-Iraq fallout, and that did start tapering off, but then the last 20 months, as laid out in your report, it comes back. And it's, I think one of the most interesting findings is your finding that it would have spiked even without Ukraine. And I think that most of us assume that the spike can be attributed to Ukraine. This is counterintuitive. And so my first, what the heck is happening, Serge, question is, what's causing that spike, if not Ukraine? Is this a long tail of COVID? Given that you actually find the Middle East is calmer, we can't attribute that deeper trend that we had before. So what's happening there? The second one is military spending. And I think still the big trend line is relatively positive. A relative decrease in the proportion of overall spending on military seems like a good thing. Obviously, the Ukraine reversal to that is not a good thing. But are we still broadly headed in a direction where military spending is going to take up less of our overall spending? I do think there's an implicit argument in here that I don't see spelled out, which is that military spending is bad. And is there any evidence, I'm assuming that there is, but is there any evidence that increases in military spending actually increase conflict risks? I think Rachel Kleinfeld's book, Savage Order, points us in that direction, but I'd be interested, Serge, in what the heck is going on there. Third, I think this is the first time the report does forecasting, maybe not. I try to look back in past ones. The Taiwan blockade prediction is a very interesting and provocative bit of the report. Is this a new function for IEP? Is this something you're going to get more into? What was the rationale for moving into this future risks? We've got the head of the Futures Lab here from the UN. It's the hot topic in the new agenda for peace, focusing more on prevention. I'd just like to know more what the heck is going on in IEP in terms of focusing on the future. I think it's a really remarkable finding. 4, and I actually just created this for listening to your report, which is this map you show of West Africa becoming more peaceful while its neighbors become worse is very counterintuitive. We assume that regional spillover is going to be bad, that contagion is going to be bad, that dominoes fall in the way that you expect them to do. Now, a cynical view might be that when you've got Mali sucking in all the bad actors, there are fewer bad actors to go around in their neighbors, and it's better off for them. That's a bit zero-sum. And as we saw from Libya, things that go bad in one country actually usually tend to create a regional knock-on effect. So, Serge, what the heck is going on there? Please tell us. This may be beyond your remit. The final one is maybe a little bit of a deeper what is going on. You talk about this as a negative peace report that is complemented by a positive peace aspect. And I noticed that positive peace is written separately from negative peace. And I wonder if something might get lost in that distinction. And I wonder, frankly, if that's something a little bit is human rights, which doesn't seem to be mentioned very much. So a country like Saudi Arabia might be pretty good on negative peace. I mean, in the sense they don't really have any active conflict, but maybe not so great on positive peace in the sense that human rights are not so great there. But there is very little mention of human rights as a key indicator of peaceful societies. There's kind of the phrase I think you use is acceptance of the rights of others, which strikes me as difficult to measure. And I just, and this also makes me think of Stefano's point about trust being so important. Nothing gets rid of trust faster than abusive state authorities cracking down on civilians. Look at Paris today. And certainly the Pathways for Peace finding in 2018 was that a sense of injustice is a major driver of conflict risks. And I just wonder, is there something around justice and accountability that maybe falls through the cracks in this distinction between positive and negative peace? But I really think that this is not what the heck is going on there, Serge Quest. It's more of a gentle question. But really, I just want to thank you for over so many years providing what I think is the most important resource, and I will be voting along Denise's lines for the Nobel Prize if she does manage to get you forward for that.
Going to vote for that. Serge, do you want to come in now or before we open the floor so all of you colleagues can think a little bit while he takes those 10 questions?
So, so first of all,
Answer all of them, please.
no, I will try. So prediction, not really. That's not the purpose of the indexes which we produce. But a lot of people are looking at China and the potential for crisis around Taiwan, the Strait of Taiwan, or even in South China Sea. So there is a huge chance for things to happen there. There is a lot of confusion between what's happening in Ukraine and what might happen there, because there are two different regions, two different potential conflicts, and different actors also, and also the quality of the actors. So I think this year we thought hey, conflicts cannot be won. Conflicts come at a certain price. If this is going to happen, what will be the price? And what will be the price for global economy? So that's one thing. I think to answer some of your questions in one answer is you need to look at the complexity of the index. So we have 23 indicators for the Global Peace Index. We have 24 indicators for the Positive Peace Report. So yes, you can highlight human rights not being respected. That would be only one of the 24 indicators. So a country like Saudi Arabia or Gulf countries in general might have problems with some of the indicators, but might be very good in the other 20 or 22 indicators. So therefore, you might see even an increase, which is the global trend for positive peace. You see an increase by, I think in the last 10 to 15 years, it's about 2.4% globally. And so every region increased in positive peace for the past decade. It's only one region who didn't, and that's North America, which is basically two countries, and Canada always had very good results in positive peace. So why? Because a country like the United States might not really score well in a vast majority of the 24 indicators at the moment. And that is not something that could be related to the current president, to the former president, but to a series of presidents before, over a decade to 15 years, which did not think it necessary to reinvest in the basis of positive peace. Maybe I should also explain how we came to this systemic approach to peacefulness in positive peace. So basically, we manage about, let's say, 60 to 80,000 data sets at the Institute for Economics and Peace. Well, we filtered out of that the 24 indicators which were most correlated with sustainable, peaceful societies, or peaceful societies which could be sustained in peace. So we came up with a systemic interaction of 8 pillars: good relations with your neighbors, good levels of good governance, free flow of what called correct information, development of human capital, high levels of human capital, low levels of corruption, sound business environment, acceptance of the rights of others, equitable distribution of resources. And each of those 8 pillars are fed with 3 different indicators. The beauty of that is the systemic approach, so we can talk about this with heads of states and government, but really grassroots level communities also. And the beauty of that also is that we can go back from those 24 indicators into 50, 100, 150 indicators, which allows us to really go to an in-depth analysis of countries, or in-depth analysis from several regions also, and really identify the priorities of action, development action, humanitarian action, and peace and conflict action also for those countries. Coming back to coastal Africa, I think there again, we need to look at the complexity of the 23 indicators, where of course there is a pressure of jihadi groups, and we all know, for working with UNOCT and UNODC on the impact of terrorism in the region, we know that there is a race for the ocean. We know that organized crime would like to have an open door from Central and Southern America through Western Africa down to the Middle East and up to Europe, because one is funding the other. We also know that most of the jihadist players there are organized crime one day and a jihadist the other day. It's a business model in the region. What we are looking at is basically also we see this potential. We see this potential for more destabilization in conflict, but we also see massive efforts by those countries not to fall into this violent trap, and we still see a level of resilience which is high enough. And I think in trying to tackle, I don't know if this was one of your questions, but maybe a subliminal questions. So what the heck is going on about those figures? What the heck is going on with conflict in the world today? When if you want to address this, you need to have a double approach. You need to first look at mitigating the impact of violence. And of course, when you double the number of conflict-related casualties, there's a lot of work to do. And at the same time, you need to increase the level of resilience of countries to absorb internal shocks and to absorb external shocks also. I think, and that's the last thing I'm going to say in this answer, we see too many, or we see only reports on impact. I was at COP27 last year. 99.9% of the reports, they focus on impact, and nobody is looking at resilience of countries to absorb the impact. And therefore, climate aid could go to really not the right countries, to countries which could still cope themselves with the impact of ecological degradation. So we need to have this double approach, mitigate the impact and increase the resilience. And positive peace is a measure of resilience, can be an alternative measures of the SDGs also, which are difficult to measure at the moment. So clearly looking at increasing resilience of societies to absorb shocks and to be able to remain stable and not to be destabilized by anything which could happen in those countries. And of course, lead to more violence also. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Serge, for that. And now, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, we're going to open up the floor for questions. And just to let you know that this is a public event, so if we normally ask you to introduce yourself before you post a question, but if you'd rather be anonymous, that's okay too. So you don't have to mention your name. Yes, please.
Can I start here?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you and to discuss about this topic. I appreciate this effort. But let me start. But before raise the question, I want to make a few comments about the map. The map itself, it's a document. And here, when you put in Western Sahara, another part of the territory, which is with another color, which means you recognize the war, because there was war have been built. And it is in yellow color. But anyway, if we see also Cuba Island, it is under yellow color. But you see, Cuba, it is under embargo since 65 years ago. But another island, course, in Mediterranean Sea, in yellow color. Italy, Spain, but France, yes. Corse is a part of France, but because it is a part of France, it should be in yellow color, but there was, remember, during the 18th in Corsica. But anyway, I take the floor to make some reflections on the topic, because I appreciate when the Ambassador Toscano raised the SDGs, and what is SDGs finally? SDGs and MDGs. But the agenda until 23. This is an aspect of the international negotiations. But can we believe in negotiation in WTO without SDGs and MDGs? I think for that, WTO is running with or without rounds. For that, in World Trade Organization, they implement peace and the trade. Imagine. Yes, small arms and landmines, but there is no legal treaty on small arms. There is a legal treaty on landmines. Landmines, it is under the institutions, Ambassador Toscano, and here I arrive to my questions, because there is truth, peace, positive and negative, but yes, after the landmines, there is another treaty who is administrated by your institutions, isn't it? Cluster munitions. It's true. Yes,
well, I mean, it is not administrated by us, but I will respond.
Yeah.
So just one question.
Yes.
Lots of people.
Only one question.
Yeah.
Only that question. I will stop about the question on the gist itself. Geneva, humanitarian demining, which is not a non-governmental organization, which is not a UN agency, but it is an institution. And after 25 years activity, yes, Nobel Prize, because Nobel Prize, it's good to Judy Williams. It didn't go for just for UN institutions. Judy Williams, she used to be the leader of the international landmines. But after 25 and under your leadership nowadays, and the peace building missions, by the UN, any country like the Yemen, who is the more affected and infected by landmines, just can contribute for the peacekeeping, peace-building missions. Well, there is and they are running. And for Yemen, it's a better example, because there is many survivors and victims on landmines under the conflict nowadays. Because your institution can contribute or no? This is my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent. All right, colleagues, we take two more. Please try to be a little bit, there's lots of people who want to say. I say one here, and then I take 2 and 3. Okay, shoot.
Thank you very much. So, well, thank you to the panelists for these very insightful remarks. I can only agree that the index is an exceptional tool. My name is Maria. I work for the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations. And at our scale, which is not the greatest, we're still a smaller agency in relative terms, we try to create these structures that could be conducive to positive peace. So I'm a little bit intrigued about the methodology on how these 24 indicators for positive peace are defined. Some beautiful music to accompany exactly, to make it more blah. Because one thing that we have at the Alliance noticed in our work is that sometimes definitions matter and they're extremely difficult to get to common agreement amongst different stakeholders. So if you could give us a little bit of a methodological insight for the positive peace indicators. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm going to take 2 more if you don't mind the panel. I had one over there and one there, and then later. Yes. Okay.
Thanks, Annika. Good afternoon. Thanks to all the panelists for the beautiful presentation. We have a question to you, Serge. So my name is Mathilde Baudard. I work for WHO's Global Health for Peace initiative. And in our initiative, we're hoping that through more inclusive health system, more equitable access to healthcare, and so on and so forth, we can make a small contribution to peace in different settings. So here my question is, it's related to the previous question, to Maria's question. It's about the indicators of positive peace. If you can tell us a bit more about the most impactful ones, and in particular, maybe if some of them are related to access to public services, management of public services, etc. Would be very interested in this. And if there's anything related to health specifically, of course, but we've already started the conversation on that. Yeah. I'm very curious to hear about it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much. Great. And yes, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is JD. I'm one of Professor Denise Garcia's students. During the conversation, I think I heard 1 or 2 times that there are no winners to war and conflict. But I think like central to stopping conflict is understanding incentives for it. And so I'm wondering, what are the perceived wins of people who are engaging in warfare? What is the incentive to engage in violence? Is it like small people high up in the government who are benefiting somewhere, or maybe people on the ground that perceive some sort of win or victory in conflict? So that's what I'm wondering about.
All right, thank you. So I'll maybe we take 2. I saw 2 more hands, so let's take them. Oh, there's more hands. Okay. We have that and that. You have to agree on one question. Yes, please.
So at the beginning of the presentation, you spoke about your presence in the media and how well and successful the Global Peace Index is doing. You do a wonderful job of presenting the facts and the data. Do you take any more opinionated roles? And by opinionated, I mean, for example, in America, if you turn on the media, you'll see that we should buy weapons to protect ourselves from crime, which obviously goes against promoting peace. We should build our AI arms and fund it heavily so that we can beat China. And this is, the media diving deep into our lives. And my closest friends and millions of Americans, and I'm assuming anywhere on the planet in many countries, believe that by having the biggest army or the best arms and technology and having a weapon to defend yourself promotes peace because of security, and that we won't have to, perish or something along those lines. With your media presence and your online presence, are you planning to expand more outside of data to start combating that news, which actually lowers peace levels?
And then if we take a last one, and then I'm going to invite the panelists not to respond to all of them, but actually pick a few, so at least each question will be responded to by at least one of you. And then, yes, so one final, yes.
Right, so my name is Rajiv. I am one of Denise Garcia's students from Northeastern University, and I just had a quick question. So you hear a lot of talk about people, talking about how AI is being weaponized today, right, as like a force against the people. And so I was just wondering, with the Global Peace Index, we already have, a database and data set of conflict trends, maybe the reasons behind conflicts, maybe how we can stop them. And in the past, a common problem of world leaders trying to come in and intervene to stop these conflicts is they might not realize the situation or like the cultures involved and the context of why the conflict is happening. And so we end up trying to resolve the conflict, but through the lens of personal interest, and it ends up going wrong sometimes. So I was just wondering, have there been any, talks or advances towards probably using AI to use these data sets and trends to have it come up with solutions without any human or personal bias? And if so, has it been implemented or is it going towards that?
All right, thank you so much. So I'm going to invite the panel to respond to them, and then after that you have a one sentence of the key takeaway from the report. Who would like to start? Respond to the question.
Yeah. You can go for left.
Oh, sorry. So no mics. Now we're just speaking in the floor. I mean, like,
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Even for the online.
yes.
Pick it up.
Okay, that's fine.
So, I mean, thank you for your question. I hope I will help clarify this, that there be no misunderstanding. We are not at all, as GCHD, the custodian of the treaties. We are one of the stakeholders that will contribute to their implementation. There are 3 treaties that are relevant to mine action. The Ottawa Convention on Anti-Personal Mine, the Oslo Convention on Cluster Munition, and then the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. And the latter is being managed within the UN. The 2 formers, they have been negotiated outside the UN, and they have set up an implementation machinery. We ourselves here in Geneva contribute to the work of the implementation machinery and even host the implementation support units, but are definitely not the custodians or the guardians of the convention. So I wanted to clarify this point, that there be no misunderstanding here. And the second, on Yemen, we are active in Yemen in collaboration with and under the framework of UNDP, trying to support what we can there. I think one of the key dimensions that you can work on during conflict is information management. That is, try to be ready once conditions permit to get on with humanitarian demining, because you have a sense of where contamination is. So to continue to gather those information and place them in a centralized database is very important. And this is what we try to do and help do, actually. And the other is risk education, because since you cannot really dig the mines out of the ground during conflict, it is important to provide risk education to the civilian population in order for them to know how to behave should they come across weapons or explosive ordnance. So those are 2 activities that are still and should still be possible during conflict. Maybe there are others, but this is where we are trying to focus in particular.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And your one sentence takeaway from the report?
Well, I would say that in spite of the report, we cannot give up. We just simply are condemned to continue to work for peace. And whatever statistics come to us, it must serve as a motivation and not as the contrary of a motivation. So let's keep at it and make it happen. I would say this.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador. Mr. Strohwald?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Miss Hilding Norberg. Yeah, positive peace. So as I explained, it's really filtering out those indicators who correlated most with sustainable, peaceful societies. I think you need to understand the systemic character of the approach. So, saying that there was, which is the most important pillar or the most important indicator, no, all 24 are important. I would say from 24, as I said, maybe 50 or more if you want to go in a deeper analysis. Also, what we really are looking at is the interaction between the different, the interconnection between the different pillars. And so sometimes you would see that, a problem of human capital can be automatically linked with a problem of corruption, because you can have like a lot of people with having high degrees, but if corruption, make sure that it's just the son or the daughter of somebody else who's getting a job, you have a problem. Of course, talking about the media and free flow of information, I think what we want to do is reach out to the three audiences which we have and also explain to them what peace is. And so, yes, we do the work there, but we want to stay independent and non-partisan. It's not up to, we're just delivering the figures. It's not up to us to, not even when we do the ranking, we're not, if your country ranks 151st, well, that's just what the data are showing. We're not expressing any judgment about the fact that you are in the bottom of the global peace index, or of course we will acclaim the fact that you are on top, but this is not a judgment from all sides. So we stay away from that. We just provide the facts and the figures. And I think the facts and the figures speak for themselves. When you do not understand what I said today, if you do not understand, as you say, that there's a lot of work to do, I guess you have a problem at some point, especially as a policymaker and decision maker. And why do we go to war? I mean, I was in the military for 30 years before working for the Institute for Economics and Peace. And one of my motivations for working for the Institute for Economics and Peace is it's the same motivation that I had when I was an officer. I was just hoping that in my second career I might have better chances to create peace with the work I was doing. We see a lot of, this is really short-sighted. When you see the investment or the economic impact for Ukraine today, even if you hope in rebuilding it, you will never achieve those figures. So it's really short-sighted. It's really, of course, focusing on some parts of your industry or some part of influence in the world also. If you look at what happened over the past weekend, I think you can see that there was a lot of ego involved in that also between, political players looking for power, access to money, access to whatever. And sometimes, to be really honest with you, I think in the 20 years when I was really active deploying troops all over the world for planning military operation, I never received a clear political goal for the missions we were engaging in. So why are we going to war? It's an excellent question. I think it's an excellent question. What we try to achieve, or what we try to say at the Institute for Economics and Peace is, we understand when you manage societies, a global or a national society, there needs to be a certain level of coercion, both in the military and in internal security forces also. But what we need to do is to invest in positive peace, to invest in a peaceful society, to make sure that your level of violence containment, which will be needed, is as low as possible. And you were talking about feedback loops, positive feedback loops. What we want to achieve is high levels of positive peace, giving low levels of grievances, giving low levels of violence or no levels of violence. You can deal with it with mediation, negotiation. Therefore, you don't need to invest in violence containment. That money can be reinvested in positive peace. That's the virtuous cycle. And you can imagine what the vicious cycle is. As you said, we see today in Paris, for example, also the rise of violent demonstrations. So, yeah, it's an excellent question. I don't have an answer to that, but it's an excellent question, and I guess I gave you part of the solution also. To go back to a last point, of course, definitions are very important. So we really chose the name of the pillars in a very specific way, because what we do when we train positive peace is explain the systemic approach, explain what we understand under the pillars, but in the training, what we want to always do is respect the cultural background of people being trained. So we might put an emphasis on human rights in this part of the world, but if you would have called it only human rights, this would have shocked other parts of the world also. So that's why we try to say acceptance of the rights of others, which is quite good. I had the opportunity to train 200 young Libyans in 2018, really still when the conflict was going on in positive peace. We had to work hard to achieve 20% of female representation in the room. So when you talk about this pillar, when you talk about this indicator, you need to approach this completely differently from a class that you would give here in Geneva at GCSP, for example. Respecting the background, respecting the cultural background of the people sitting in front of you, while explaining that statistically, systemically, this is going to create better societies, and more peaceful societies, and less violent societies. My takeaway, I guess I'm with you. You look at a plate which is very big and very hot, but you need to put the first drop on it at some point. And I was really pleased with your approach when you spoke about the individual approach to more peaceful societies. I think it's everybody's responsibility, and why are liberal democracies working better on top of the global peace index? Because somebody is doing something wrong, and every 4 years you have a chance to make sure somebody else is we can try to make a better job also at that moment. So we need to see the individual responsibility. We need to hold those people accountable for what they are doing, and those are the one in power, the politics in power. And we need to make sure that we remain the capacity to influence our own future, but also the future of our societies and the global society.
Invest in positive peace. Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And now we will notice we're coming close to the hour, so I'll give you a good challenge to share your final comments, thoughts, please.
So the answer about the AI and no biases, that's why we're here in Geneva for. And I look forward to attending the AI for Good Summit coming up next week to learn the answer to your question and working with you and other members of our delegation to figure those out. Well, we live in a world where pessimism really rules, right? Bad news are everywhere, bad news is in the news. And being pessimistic and being critical really equates with high-mindedness somehow and wisdom. You see, Mr. Trump would be an excellent example of that. And it fuels nationalisms and other things. But being optimistic and having optimism in one's heart takes much more work, actually, because it really requires you to dig deeper into the data that is available on the long trends, on the deeper trends that are happening in our world today. We are living in a moment of extraordinary technological scientific revolution. We are living through the green transition, through green economy. So we can't forget about that. I am here surrounded by four peacemakers who write about it, Adam's excellent book on the most turbulent region in the world there, the Central Africa, one of the most turbulent regions. So I have great hope because I know so many people working for peace every day, tirelessly. So being optimistic requires us to take a look at the bigger picture. And the GPI, the Global Peace Index, and the other indices at the Institute just gives us a step-by-step way of remaining optimistic.
Thank you. I love that. Wonderful. Thank you. Adam.
I think I have 1 minute. I think JD's question, that's right, about incentives is a really important one. And I think the starting point for me is that nobody will claim that they're in favor of war. If you ask Vladimir Putin what he wants to do, he doesn't want war. War is the way to achieve the objective which he wants, which is territorial control of resources. I spent a year in Eastern Congo talking to armed groups, and none of them would say we want to fight, but fighting was the way they could achieve what they wanted. And there's a whole series of books about how violence is how you express political need in South Sudan as well. And so I think the key point around incentives is actually, again, this systemic approach that is so well laid out in this report. And it's about building an architecture so that people can achieve what they want without resorting to violence. And I actually think that's a better starting point. I think your question is probably the most important one. And you've got a whole bunch of behavioral scientists, including some in this building, that are quite good at design architecture. And I think it does come back to trying to figure out what small changes in systems can actually change those path dependencies. And I want to end with a kind of odd final sentence that it somewhat intimated in here, but one of the things that seems to be strongly correlated is the relationship between women leadership and good governance. And you see it in COVID and you see it in conflict. And so if I have one sentence actually to solve a lot of this, it's elect women leaders, because they're going to fix many of the problems that we see in here. And I think that it's one of those slightly counterintuitive systemic approaches you can take that will actually have a huge knock-on effect. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just, on behalf of the co-organizers, again, thank the co-organizers very, very much for panelists for sharing their views, and also to you colleagues for engaging and raising questions. And I hope we will all together do justice to report. Not just, okay, I was there, I listened, very interesting, let's go back. And this is really the beginning of working with this. And I also, of course, want to thank very much my dear colleagues at the GCSP who have all made it possible, without whom we would not have had this conversation. good afternoon, and please welcome back.